Hi, welcome to the Funding Blueprint Unlocking Startup Success presented by StartHub. I'm Cody Goff, and today you're going to learn about strategies for early stage funding, as well as post-funding strategies and leadership skills. My guest is Nina Raab, founder and CEO of LionRun Consulting, which helps startups and venture funds prepare to raise capital. They specialize in building investor collateral that gains the attention of investors and allows founders to be confident in positioning and pitching their company. Nina has worked with more than 80 startups across the US and Israel. So to start our conversation, I asked her, which funding stages do you work on, and which do you find startups struggle with the most? Here's our conversation.
Well, thanks, Cody, for having me on. I appreciate it. So I primarily work with companies anywhere from pre-seed to usually Series B up to C. And usually it's tech companies both in the US and Israel. And in terms of what stage I see companies struggle with, it's usually at the point, and sometimes, like, let's say the company could have some pre-seed funding, but they're at the point where they need more of a proof of concept or some kind of traction to really gain the attention of an investor. But in order to do that, they need capital to implement that. And so they're kind of in this position of which comes first, the chicken or the egg. And I think that really is the most challenging part of the startup journey. So if you're able to get that, or get those POCs, or get those get some sort of traction to be able to show an investor, like, hey, this is what we've done, this is the success we've had so far, then it can, and you're able to do that in a pretty, scrappy way, as, whatever that takes. I think that puts a company in a way better position once they speak to a potential investor.
Can you think of any particularly creative ways or scrappy ways a startup has been able to get that traction where you looked at it, you're like, wow, they did this with that? Okay, let's look into some funding here.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it comes down to the grind of the founders and being able to think creatively of how to penetrate their certain market. So for an example, a startup that I was working with, their target market would be college campuses or college students. And they were here in Israel, and they asked me, how can we show that we will be successful? Can you help us? And I told them, I say, hey, at the point where you're at, you guys need to be as scrappy as possible. Go to the main universities here in Israel, Technion, Tel Aviv University, Hebrew University, Bar Ilan. And I'm you guys were all students at some of those universities. You have those connections already, and do whatever you can to either speak to the higher ups at those universities who can then implement it within their curriculum or whatever it is, or, get it to the student body and get that done here in Israel to show that proof of concept. And then you can then expand into the US market. And rather than thinking way too broadly, and then it's kind of a little bit more overwhelming versus start small and work your way.
So you said that one of the biggest problems is proving that kind of proof of concept, show a little bit of traction. When working in the tech startup space, which you do, when it comes to the technology, are there ever situations where a startup has an issue scaling up because maybe they got their MVP, but their ultimate vision of what their technology will be or be able to do is impossible to build without some kind of capital? Is that something that ever comes up, and how is that overcome?
Yeah, definitely. But in terms of that, usually there's certain types of either VCs or grants that you can get that's dedicated towards those types of, very, very high tech or deep tech, where it's all based on the technology and the research and everything that goes behind it. So and usually that's like with very, very technical founders. So I think there's like other types of funding that can come into that, where it's either grants or, like I said, like specific types of VCs that are like, let's say deep tech VCs, where like the technology needs to be fully built and there is a lot of capital that goes into that first. Also, biotech suffer from that a lot too, because usually biotech requires a lot of capital. So you have to be able to, I guess, identify those types of investors that are interested in those types of projects.
So then let's talk about when they have the proof of concept. Maybe it's going well and they've got some traction. What specific elements of the pitch process do you see startups needing the most help with?
Usually simplifying as much as possible.
Really?
Oh, 100%. Because a founder, you're ingrained in the company, and it's often difficult, I think, for founders to be able to take a step back and really articulate their company and their business, especially if they're a technical founder, because they look at it from a technical perspective. But when you're speaking to an investor, they're looking at it from a business perspective. They're looking at it, how are they going to see their returns? And if you start getting to the nitty gritty of the tech, you're going to lose someone's attention, especially if they're all not super technical in that specific, I guess, out in those elements. So it's really, I find, someone could explain something to me for 30 minutes. And then I'm like, wait, so is what you're saying is X, Y, and Z? They're like, oh, yeah. I'm like, well, you could have just said that. You know what I mean? Like, explain it like you're explaining it to your grandma. And I think that articulation is one of the biggest things that people and founders struggle with. It's really about storytelling at the end of the day.
Let's talk about the nuts and bolts of what it's like to work with LionRun. So you're working with a startup. They have a successful pitch. What happens then? The startup got the money, they're done. They just get to move on and spend it. They start clearing their checks with people. Talk me through like the day-to-day of like, hey, you're funded. Now what kind of happens from there?
Pretty much a lot of the groundwork before they receive the funding actually is figuring out where they're going to allocate those funds. Because an investor, if they're giving their money to someone or a team, they want to know where it's going. So that has to be already pretty much allocated and divided up and articulated even before. And then once they get the funding and once they go through all the due diligence and whatnot, then they're just implementing what was pretty much set in stone before. So like they have, let's say, 20% in marketing, 50% in R&D, and 30% for admin, or something. I'm just making up, allocations, but something along those lines. It's pretty much just, and being able to make sure that they're spending that money in a smart way within the time frame that they budgeted out, which is what a company's runway. That's what a runway is, or that word came from. Do
you have any guidelines around, or a sense of the most effective type of budgeting? Like how specific should the budgeting be? I mean, are we talking like line item, number by, dollar by dollar, exactly how we'll spend it, or allocations more, appropriate, like you said, 50% R&D, 20% marketing? What kind of balance is there in the specificity you have to have coming up front?
It really depends on where the company is at. If they're earlier, it's harder to, I guess, be able to project that breakdown of the funds and where it will have to be allocated. Sometimes it's a balancing act with kind of trial and error the earlier they are. But once you get to a certain point, you should have your go-to-market strategy should be so fleshed out that you know pretty well how much you'll spend on marketing, or how many new people are you going to bring on your team for sales, something along those lines. And that really is where having a strong financial model, one, based on your historicals, and two, accurate projections and assumptions, is what I guess helps you guide that budgeting and the time frame and how much runway you have.
Yeah, it's a mystery to me how anyone can plan for staffing with like salary ranges, specific or hiring developers, programmers, right? If you say like, well, the salary is 120 to 150K, then like, that's a big difference in budget, right? Across 10 programmers. Any sense of how startups can most effectively tackle that?
I mean, I guess there is a range. I guess having those conversations with those potential people who you would bring on beforehand, because that's how you build out your that's how you build out your projections. You have to talk to people. You have to get an idea of what the market pricing is and whatnot. So I guess it doesn't need to be, you don't have to go super, super into the nitty gritty, but you should have a general idea what is a normal in the market for different pricings or salaries, or if you need to hire a marketing agency for something. Yeah.
Yeah. So you've been doing the LionRun Consulting thing for well over a year. You're crushing it. What inspired you to do the work that you're doing now? Like, what problem did you see that needed solving, and how do you feel like you're solving it?
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting how I got into this. While I was actually in very early on in college, I was involved in an organization that allows U.S. college students to do consulting for Israeli startups. So a lot of big universities across the U.S., they all have a chapter. It's called Tamid. And so where I was at University of Illinois, we didn't have a big chapter. And so I totally revamped it, and pretty much by the end of my college career, we had a chapter of 80 students, probably 12 projects of students connected with different companies, and they would work on projects throughout the semester. So that's really what inspired it early on. But it was a mentor through that organization who I had who would do fractional CFO work for startups. And he was the one who then started bringing me on to actually work with the companies on a contracting basis. And then I started just seeing a repetition of the problems that these companies had, and then would ask me to do. And that's really where I started building out this approach. And one thing led to another. And, I guess once you do something for so long, your reputation compounds. And then that's how LionRun was built.
Anything in particular that was like a tough learning curve when you founded LionRun Consulting that maybe you wish you had known back then, what you know now?
Yeah, I mean, everything is always a learning curve. They don't teach you in school how to run your own company. There's things that come up that you're every single day, it's like putting out fires, because there's, at least with the type of business where I'm running, where it is I guess you could say it's a mix of a consultancy, agency. I wouldn't categorize it in one or the other. It's kind of like a mix. But they don't teach you in school how to run your own business. And I studied finance and data science in a undergraduate business school. But the biggest thing is learning, one, how to work in the business versus work on the business, if that makes sense. And I think once you get to a point where you can take a step back, and even and a lot of times that requires your first hire to work in the business, which buys you time to work on the business and build that brand and bring in more clients. And it's a huge learning curve. And it kind of is you have to take a little bit of a leap of faith in terms of trusting someone else or other people. So, but I think once you're able to do that, things really, you can see what having that time to work on the business does.
I liked that analogy. I want to double click on that. Working in the business versus on the business. So what would you describe as working in the business?
So working in the business would be like, let's say a client needs, they come back to you and they need a bunch of little edits, and it's like every day for like a week they're asking you to do little edits. That's very time consuming. If you have someone else who's on your team, who knows how you work and whatever, they can do that for like, and so then that buys you time, pretty much being able to delegate as much as possible. That's something that's a very like minuscule task, even admin things, invoicing, even replying to certain emails, anything that you can really automate or delegate. Those are things that would be considered working in the business. Working on the business is building an external brand. It's making connections with people, going to events. So then it builds your name and people get to know you and you bring in more business. That's working on the business.
Cool. Thank you for describing that. I like the way you put it. No one is taught how to be a CEO. You've worked with many startup founders, and I'm sure you've seen many CEOs do some different things. Maybe some were pretty cool or not. Is there anything you've seen another CEO do or that jumped out and you were like, ooh, I should do that? Do you think other founders could also maybe borrow from?
I think the biggest thing that I've seen in the very, very top CEOs that I've worked with is the ability to have very fast decision-making and confidence in their decisions, and being able to like think quick on their feet. I worked with this one company and pretty much they were creating individual private flying vehicles that were electric.
Nice.
And like, that's not an easy task. And they have a huge team. They have prototype, like their facility is huge, and there's so many moving parts because you have the engineering side, you have the business development side. And one thing I saw in their CEO was his confidence and just like ability to make quick decisions, because having analysis paralysis when running that type of business is not the best thing. But that's probably the biggest thing that I think I've seen in very successful CEOs.
Very cool. Well, if you're listening to this, startup founder, and you want to work with Nina and LionRun Consulting, then visit lionrunconsulting.com. And I wanted to flag, there's a quote right there on the front page that I wanted to share. It's, quote, "Without exception, every single company that I send to LionRun comes back to me thrilled. I continue to send leads and they continue to deliver. I will be working with LionRun for years to come," unquote. And that quote comes from Hillel Fold, a startup advisor and tech columnist, who was also our first guest ever on the Funding Blueprint. So as if, Nina, this conversation wasn't impressive enough, you could take it from Hillel, just take it from him that LionRun really knows their stuff. So clearly doing great work. And, I hope you do even better in the future. And, we all know that people invest in founders, not just the startups. So I think your profile is going to go pretty high pretty soon. Everyone's going to be paying attention to Nina. So watch out, world, right?
Thank you, Cody. I appreciate it.
Of course. Yeah. Thanks so much for joining me, and have a great rest of your week.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation. If you crave even more startup conversations and you would like to connect directly with other entrepreneurs and even investors, then you should join StartHub's Discord server. It's completely free, and you can find a link to that in the description of today's episode. The Funding Blueprint is produced by me, Cody Goff, with audio and video editing by Sean Patel. If you're looking for exceptional sound design or audio-video production work, then get in touch with Sean at seanpatel.com. One last thing, I cannot believe I used the phrase, "I want to double click on that" in this interview. Business jargon is actually taking over my brain, so I'm gonna go for a walk. Hopefully you can take a walk as well. Maybe you're doing that while you're listening to this. But don't worry, I'll still be back next week. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you then.